Gözüm yolda, gönlüm darda. Ya kendin gel ya da haber yollarım. Yazmışım 2 satır mektup, vermişim trene halimi unutup. Kara tren gecikir, belki hiç gelmez. Dağlarda salınır da derdimi bilmez. Dumanın savurur, halimi görmez. Gam dolar yüreğim, gözyaşım dinmez. Kara tren gecikir, belki hiç gelmez. Dağlarda salınır da derdimi bilmez. Dumanın savurur.
Düşlediğin geleceğe giden bir yol var. Gelişimin adı demir harflerle yazılacak o yola. Yenilik sesleri yükselecek Türkiye'den dünyaya. Gelecek güzel günler raylardan ulaşacak bizlere. Şimdi başlayan bu dönüşüm yarınların öncüsü, gelecek günlerin öncesi olacak. Demir yolu atılımı demir ağlarla örülmüş Türkiye'ye çok yakışacak. Türk Demiryolu Zirvesi.
Hello everybody, my name is Daniel Huber. Today I would like to talk about the future of mobility, and the title of my short keynote is all about connectivity. So first of all, let me introduce Moodley Industrial Design, my company, to you. We are an innovation-driven and strategic design company. We transform business and create growth. For our clients, in all what we do, we feel responsible for the future because we look into the future in a very focused way, and our aim is to design things that improve life. Moodley is a group and design group and offers holistic solutions. So we have Moodley Service Design, we have brand identity services, we have interactive digital services, and also Moodley Industrial Design, so all under one roof. We have 6 locations and 1 global team, also in Istanbul, Wuhan, in the US, and 3 locations in the heart of Europe. We see ourselves as long-term partners, and we understand long-term visions. We work for a lot of companies worldwide. For us, it's very important that we work for companies which are innovation-driven as we are. So we are about 120 strategists, design and innovation experts. We have about 70 years of experience in international projects, also with worldwide leading companies. And we have around 700 projects worldwide done. And as you see, we are very focused on mobility design. And Moodley Industrial Design is focused on 2 fields of activity, that's mobility and product. And there we develop strategies, innovations, and industrial designs in product, for example, for engine building industry, for ICT, electronics, and for consumer, like you see here, some few samples. And in mobility, we work for aerospace industry. We make concepts for land and sea mobility. So here you see also a few samples of our works, and you see we do a lot of trains, ships, planes, and so on. And we develop also future mobility systems or visions for the future. As designers, we always have a focused look into the future in about also 20 years or something like that. So to start with my keynote, I want to talk a little bit about our client ÖBB, the Austrian Federal Railways. It's EU's most successful railway company. And before we started, ÖBB looked like this. They had very old trains at this time before 2010. And there was a big reform of the railways. And then we were asked to design new high-speed trains or speed trains, intercity trains, the railjets. We said, yes, we like to do that, but we have to design trains as places we would like to be in, with four thematic focuses, with intelligent workspace, also with space of retreat, space for enjoy and free time, and also a safety furniture. And we started to design these trains in exterior and interior way. We made three, so let me say, classes. We had a business and a premium class, economy, and also a catering service, a new concept for that. So the railjets became benchmark of a branch in the heart of Europe. We also did then, in the holistic point of view, the regional train concepts for ÖBB, the city jets, because railjets needed a brother in the regional commuting transport situation. And so we also did these trains in a very clear way of design and a very clear way of branding the trains. And it's what I want to say here, it's not only about designing trains, it's also about the holistic view to a company and how a company looks like. It's also about information services and also about apps and ticketing systems. So from our point of view, the most important thing when we look into the future of mobility is a holistic way to design companies and services. So this was an example of the present, but we have to look into the future. And so we have to create visions and bring them also to life. And because why is it so important to create visions? The future does not exist at the moment. The future is an image in our minds that we can design. And to look into the future, we have to look into the past. And if we want to create the future of mobility, we have to look into the past and see how people were mobile from the beginning on. And one of the most important things how to be mobile are our feet. And it started like this, but the mobility needs were and are still changing dramatically. And there was a disruptive idea of mobility in the beginning, and this was the invention of the wheel. And the invention of the wheel is such an important thing that about 99% of our mobility are based on wheels. And we have to ask ourselves which transport mode is the most effective. And you see from the economically and energy point of view, it's the long distance train. But the transport mode choice is still, these are numbers from Central Europe, is the car. It's about 64% of people still choose the car as the primary mode being mobile. And why is it like that? Because the total advertising spendings in the automotive industry are 10 times higher as like in the public transportation. Also, why we are mobile is a very important question to answer. And here you see it's about 32% free time, it's about 22 shopping and 26 working. And if we want to design transport modes of the future, we have to look at these numbers because we have to create mobile living spaces. And what are the challenges for the future of mobility? Time is the new scarcity. People have less and less time. People have to work, have to live, have to be mobile. And we have also the limiting factors of emissions and space. And this causes some needs. And what we need is that we, for the future, if we want to rescue our world, we need a sustainable mobility, and we also need holistic, connected mobility systems. This is very important that we create connected mobility systems. And for the passengers and for the people, it has to be really, really, really easy going to be accepted. The question now is, how can we enhance the attractiveness of sustainable mobility, and how can we get as many people as possible to switch their transportation mode into a ecological way? And this needs a new interaction between citizens, politics, and also companies to cause this change in values. So we have to see, especially in public transport, we have to see the transport modes as mobile living and working space. And if we look into, for example, automotive industry, from the beginning on, cars and automotives were designed for driving. Then it changed in the 90s or beginning of 2000s, driving and other services. And now it changes into other services and being mobile to get in this combination. But in the focus more and more are the other services while being mobile. And there's also a paradigm shift from my point of view. We should not call it mass transport. I think we should call it transport of individuals with special needs. Because if we only see a lot of people as a mass of people, everyone is an individual and has individual needs and focuses. So what I always say to our clients is, love your customers and get known your customers, then you also meet the needs. And we also need integrated chains of mobility, and this is both important, that we have a good digitalization where services can be used, but we need also the hardware to use intermodal mobility. And the future, from our point of view, is the intermodal mobility, and it's also a reduction of complexity. As I said, for the customers, is very important the easygoing way of being mobile. It's also very important that we look at urbanization, because soon 70% of the world's population will live in cities, and it's not only about mega cities, for example, like Istanbul with about 20 million inhabitants. There is also urbanization in small cities like with 100,000 inhabitants and less. And for that, there are inventions of about thousands and thousands of new mobility concepts we see. For example, this is also made by us. It's a level 3 city mobility for cities who can't grow in the square miles. They have to grow in the height. There are a lot of concepts now also, for example, ThyssenKrupp multi-elevator. It's a maglev elevation systems. We have a lot of pod systems for cargo and personal transport, individual one-person mobility concepts, also for cargo transporting, autonomous trucking systems, and autonomous passenger transport. Yeah, you see a lot of mobility concepts. Also, Hyperloop is very important. Let's see how they go on. And drones and the air is also at the new space above our land. And here I have also an example of Ital design. It's a combination of a pod system with a street carrier system made by Audi and a drone made by Airbus. But we have still intermodal mobility that does not work. And the question is, why does the intermodal mobility still not work as it could? Because we have all technologies and also all digital services to make them run. And I think it's about the philosophy and about thinking. And we figured out 3 reasons. The reason one is because, first of all, each mobility system optimizes itself. Each branch optimizes its own projects, and you see 150 years of innovation in railway industry is that railway did not change in the system. Trains became faster, safer, and so on, but there was no system innovation from the beginning on. But there was a disruptive idea at the beginning, because this idea you have to have that you put iron tracks to a countryside way to be able to transport persons and cargo in a very, very effective way. And also 120 years of innovation in the car industry. The car was invented, but it changed not in the system. It only changed in a lot of detail innovations in the car itself. But the architecture of the car stood the same. We have 4 wheels, we have 5 seats, we have a steering wheel and the engine in front. And if you look at the last 40 or 50 years of innovation, of the benchmark car of a class like the Volkswagen Golf, you see also there is a lot of innovations in these cars, but there is no system innovation in the last 120 years. But there was also a disruptive idea at the beginning, because this idea you also have to have, and it's genius, to bring the horses, to change the horses into horse powers, and bring it into the vehicle instead of being in front of the vehicle. Reason 2 why intermodal mobility doesn't work as it could work is because we do not think in holistic systems. And, as I showed you before, we did mobile concepts and projects like cars, like trains, like buses, like ships. And everyone told us, okay, our thing is the best and it's the optimum of being mobile. But we only see there are a lot of good ways being mobile, but it can only be a combination of more mobile modes to get really a good intermodal and seamless mobility. And the reason 3, because we do not have standardized and compatible hardware systems. And if you look at car and train, each is a nearly closed system, and we need also here connectivity, not only in the digital way, but also in the hardware way. And now I will show you a future concept where we try to solve these problems, and this is a really big playground for future, also for digital services, and I think it will be a revolution, or could be a revolution in the hardware and also in the digital world. We want to shape super mobility through intermodal innovation, and at the core of our concept is a pod, is a little container with standardized dimensions. And inside, it can be filled with an individual interior design for passengers, or cargo transport. And the system is multi-directional. It's not only like, for example, the concept that we saw, bidirectional from street to drones. Our concept that we developed together with Siemens Mobility is a concept that goes in a lot of directions, like trains. The train is, from our point of view, the backbone transport system, because it's on continental. It's from our point of view the most effective, as I told you at the beginning of my keynote. We can use these pods on the streets, also on Hyperloop, also on ships, and also in the air and elevators. And here are some impressions, for example, at the usage at the rail carrier. Here we have a concept that we have some public commuting pods in the longer version. We have also private pods who can be used also at the same systems and also for commuting and for regional transport modes, like can be have an interior like this for more people. And here you see the same system is compatible for cargo and also for passenger transport. So when we look at the person transport, the passenger transport, we can design these interiors individual for working, also for living, for commuting and other services. And the digitalization opens a lot of playgrounds for that, because the journey, the passenger journey could be like that you order a pod to your home and it comes, you get into your private pod in a business or in an office, mobile office, and you're brought to another hub, for example, to a cable car, and the cable car brings you to the railway station, and there you are transformed from cable car to the train. You not have to get out of your own pod, but you can if you want, but it's not needed. And the train brings you to the super hub, for example, and also the cargo transport works in this system. And there you are transformed then also to a drone, for example, if you need it. And at the moment, we are working also on projects like autonomous rescue systems. So you see, this system is a new definition of mobility, and it's a new definition of intermodal mobility. And here I'm at the end of my short keynote, and I would like to show also a film to you, which shows, from my point of view, in a good way, how this system works. One moment. And now let's go. Oh, I saw that you could not see my screen. Okay. Yeah, sorry. I saw that you could not see my screen. I don't know how to. Yes, I am sorry. So I will show you this film again. Did you see it also? I hope it works now. So thank you, everybody, and I hope it worked now with the film.
Gözüm yolda, gönlüm darda. Ya kendin gel ya da haber yolla. Duyarım yazmışın 2 satır mektup. Vermişin trene halimi unutup. Kara tren gecikir, belki hiç gelmez. Dağlarda salınır da derdimi bilmez. Dumanın savurur, halimi görmez. Gam dolar yüreğim, gözyaşım dinmez. Kara tren gecikir, belki hiç gelmez. Dağlarda salınır da derdimi bilmez. Dumanın savurur.
Düşlediğin geleceğe giden bir yol var. Gelişimin adı demir harflerle yazılacak o yola. Yenilik sesleri yükselecek Türkiye'den dünyaya. Gelecek güzel günler raylardan ulaşacak bizlere. Şimdi başlayan bu dönüşüm yarınların öncüsü, gelecek günlerin öncesi olacak. Demir yolu atılımı demir ağlarla örülmüş Türkiye'ye çok yakışacak. Türk Demiryolu Zirvesi. Düşlediğin geleceğe giden bir yol var. Gelişimin adı demir harflerle yazılacak o yola. Gelecek güzel günler raylardan ulaşacak bizlere. Demir yolu atılımı demir ağlarla örülmüş Türkiye'ye çok yakışacak. Türk Demiryolu Zirvesi.
Gözüm yolda, gönlüm darda. Ya kendin gel ya da haber yolla. Duyarım yazmışın 2 satır mektup. Vermişin trene halimi unutup. Kara tren gecikir, belki hiç gelmez. Dağlarda salınır da derdimi bilmez. Dumanın savurur, halimi görmez. Gam dolar yüreğim, gözyaşım dinmez. Kara tren gecikir, belki hiç gelmez. Dağlarda salınır da derdimi bilmez. Dumanın savurur.
Düşlediğin geleceğe giden bir yol var. Gelişimin adı demir harflerle yazılacak o yola. Gelecek güzel günler raylardan ulaşacak bizlere. Demir yolu atılımı demir ağlarla örülmüş Türkiye'ye çok yakışacak. Türk Demiryolu Zirvesi. Düşlediğin geleceğe giden bir yol var. Gelişimin adı demir harflerle yazılacak o yola. Gelecek güzel günler raylardan ulaşacak bizlere. Demir yolu atılımı demir ağlarla örülmüş Türkiye'ye çok yakışacak. Türk Demiryolu Zirvesi.
Gözüm yolda, gönlüm darda. Ya kendin gel ya da haber yolla. Duyarım yazmışın 2 satır mektup. Vermişin trene halimi unutup. Kara tren gecikir, belki hiç gelmez. Dağlarda salınır da derdimi bilmez. Dumanın savurur, halimi görmez. Gam dolar yüreğim, gözyaşım dinmez. Kara tren gecikir, belki hiç gelmez. Dağlarda salınır da derdimi bilmez. Dumanın belki hiç gelmez. Dağlarda salınır da derdimi bilmez. Dumanın savurur, halimi görmez. Gam dolar yüreğim, gözyaşım dinmez. Kara tren gecikir, belki hiç gelmez. Dağlarda salınır da derdimi bilmez.
Düşlediğin geleceğe giden bir yol var. Gelişimin adı demir harflerle yazılacak o yola. Gelecek güzel günler raylardan ulaşacak bizlere. Demir yolu atılımı demir ağlarla örülmüş Türkiye'ye çok yakışacak. Türk Demiryolu Zirvesi.
Hello. Hello. Yep. Okay. I still can't hear anything. Yeah, I can see I'm on screen, but I can't hear anything. Okay. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, and for joining the conference today and for having this opportunity to talk to you about my particular perspective of the railways. What I would like to do is to take this opportunity to talk to you about the development of the railways over the last couple of 100 years now, but primarily from the perspective of the ownership, the control, the management of the railways, and how this has changed, generally speaking, in similar ways around the world with similar stories. But I would like to naturally, and I hope you don't mind, approach this primarily from a UK perspective, because the UK has certainly has had very complicated issues in determining how best to run the railways over the last 20 or so years. But if we go back to the start, of course, which was part of the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century, the creation or the invention of the steam locomotive, and at the time the recognition by particularly manufacturers that a new way was arriving, putting their goods to their customers, to their ports, for bringing in their raw materials in the form of the steam locomotive, replacing particularly at that time the canals, and also the rather poor quality road systems which existed at that time. So the railway originally, something which was going to be for carrying freight, required by manufacturers, and therefore quite naturally invested in at that time by private sector people who wanted to put their money into this new form of transport. And indeed, through the rapid during that period in the mid-19th century, and in the UK particularly, we saw what many people described as a mania, in which it was like a South Sea bubble in which everybody wanted to invest in this new form of transport. And by 1865, the whole of the UK rail network had been laid down, some 20,000 miles, crisscrossing the nation with fierce competition between these different private sector owners and operators. As is so often the case in circumstances like this, what happens? Well, many of those investors lost their money. They'd invested in railways which essentially were not economic, in which the returns, whether it was initially from freight, but then of course subsequently more from passenger trains, the revenue just did not meet the cost of capital which had been invested, and sooner or later companies went bust, and so you had the merger of businesses and a decline in the number. But even so, by the time of the First World War, probably still 100 different companies operating railways on a private sector basis in the UK. The First World War, as so often is the case, saw the government take over the railways and took the railways away from their private sector owners and operated and controlled the railways as the government. At the end of the war, it was decided that the railways would be, in 1921, the railways would be handed back to private sector. But instead of handing it back to the 120, in fact, companies which had existed before the First World War, the government decided that there would just be 4 major rail companies, privately owned and invested in, but in fact regional companies. So the country was split up into 4 different regions, and those 4 regional companies operated the railway. Now, come to the 1930s, and what do we see? Well, we see worldwide recession, we see unemployment, and so the government then sees the opportunity to encourage employment by putting money into the railways, and particularly into new rolling stock. So we saw a lot of new rolling stock come into the UK railway at that time, new high-speed locomotives, but trains which in fact were paid for to a large extent by the government. Second World War takes over the railways. It takes over the railways, and the railways by the end of the Second World War have been very heavily used. They've been destroyed in parts and bombed by enemy action, poorly maintained, but still standing on their feet, and actually with quite a high level of usage, because they are one of the main means of transporting both people and goods around the country. In 1948, we have a left-wing new Labour government, and you will see this in different countries around the world, a decision by governments at that time to nationalise the railway, to take the railway under public control. And in the UK, a single integrated company called British Rail, whose directors and board were all appointed by the government, and the government fundamentally financing the railway. What happens over the next 40 years, of course, is that we see a rapid use around the world and in the UK of the motor car. And so the motor car starts to become more dominant, rail use starts to fall away, passenger numbers in the UK by the time you get to mid-1970s are half what they were at the end of the Second World War. They're down to about 750 million passenger journeys a year compared with the 1.5 billion which existed after the war. The railway also has a fairly poor image in the public's mind, is often the butt of music hall jokes by comedians, and essentially the good old British Rail is seen as being part of British fabric, but something which people hold with some amusement and almost at times contempt. What doesn't help British Rail as a board is the fact that the government will only finance them on an annual basis. So each year, British Rail is not entirely certain how much money it's going to have the following year, so it's very difficult to make any sort of long-term plans because of this annualised budget which it is provided for from the government. In the 1960s, the government, realising that everything is not going too well, commissions a review of the railways. This resulted in what was essentially a famous, or according to your point of view, infamous report by Dr. Beeching, which recommended the closure of at least a third of the railway, closing large swathes of local district railways and focusing on what was seen as the more economic and viable parts of the railway, the intercity and commuting lines. After Beeching, a similar report came up with similar conclusions. And today the railway is approximately 2/3 of the size that it was. So today it's about 20,000 kilometres, but about 2/3 of its original size at the end of the Second World War. Like so often around the world, it's a heavily congested railway on the commuting lines into the cities, particularly during the peak hours in the morning and in the evening. In 1993, the new Prime Minister, Conservative Prime Minister John Major, decided to privatise the railways. In the previous 10 years, under Margaret Thatcher, the government had privatised nearly all the utilities. So telecoms, gas, electricity, all of this had been privatised quite successfully under Margaret Thatcher. But ironically, she had seen rail as being too difficult. New Prime Minister, anxious to win his spurs, decides he'll do something the previous Prime Minister hasn't done, and so decides that he will privatise the railways. Now, around this time, the European Union had also recommended and required that the management of railways be commercially divided between the rolling stock operator and the track operator, and that the rolling stock operator would pay an access fee to access the track to the track owner. The Swedes had been the first country to adopt this approach in Europe and in the late 80s, but with mixed results, as once again some train operators went bankrupt. This separation of track from wheel is fundamentally opposed by many traditional railwaymen who believe that the vertical integration of management systems is essential to a good service. The UK approach, and there were different views. John Major, the Prime Minister, actually wanted to revert to the 1930s and just have 4 regional railways vertically integrated. But Treasury and more right-wing thinkers required the separation of wheel from rail, and in fact recommended the breakup of the railway into a whole series of separate operating systems. And it was broken up, in fact, British Rail was broken up into, ironically, going back to the First World War, over 100 different companies. Created private rolling stock leasing companies. The freight trains were given to 2 mainly private operators, but they also owned the rolling stock. The operation of the passenger train services was put in the hands of train operating companies, and they were required to bid for franchises, approximately in the early days of about 7 years duration. And they bid on the basis of either requiring the minimum amount of subsidy from government, because they were running as, in fact, at the end of the day, did not make a profit but required a subsidy, so they would request a level of subsidy. Or if it was a service which was likely to be more profitable, then a certain percentage of the profit would be returned to government, and clearly the one who suggested he would give the maximum amount back to government or required the least subsidy were the companies who won the franchises. These companies were called TOCs, or train operating companies, and they paid a charge to Railtrack. Now Railtrack, of course, owned all the tracks and all the stations, and so they had a monopoly, and therefore they had to be overseen by a rail regulator, so another body, the Office of Rail Regulation. Every 5 years, the regulator determines the amount of money that the infrastructure owner can spend and invest in operation, maintenance and renewals. But that at least is better than the government's annualised approach to British Rail, so giving Railtrack or the owner of the infrastructure more certainty as to how much money they could expect to be able to invest into the railways. The regulator also sets efficiency targets for the period. It has the power to fine the company for performance failures, for example, high levels of delay caused by infrastructure failure. Historically, approximately 2/3 of all delays to trains are caused by infrastructure failure and approximately 1/3 by train operator problems. The franchises were originally, there were 25 of them, that's subsequently been reduced, but 25 separate franchises were overseen and they were placed by a new organisation called the Office for Rail Franchising. Overseeing the overall strategy of the railway was another new body, the Strategic Rail Authority, who reported to government. Within 10 years, both of these organisations had been disbanded and their roles taken over directly by government. Under a franchise, the train operator runs the trains, collects the fares, maintains the trains on a daily basis, not major renewal of a train, but the actual day-to-day maintenance. It leases from Railtrack, or leased from Railtrack. The majority of the stations, Railtrack retained the largest stations in and around London, and also it had the ability to invest in new car parks at those stations where it could collect the revenues, or in some cases where there were longer franchises, and this was a debate, how long or how short should a franchise be, and the longer franchise, the train operating company was quite willing to sometimes invest in new small stations where it could see the opportunity to attract more passengers. On the freight side, rail freight companies did not have to bid for a franchise, but were given open access to the railway, but of course had to negotiate the paths which they needed with Railtrack. And Railtrack were responsible for the overall operation of the infrastructure, for deciding and agreeing with the train operating companies the timetables, and also for controlling the signalling. In freight terms, the railway today, of course, only carries about 8 to 10% of all freight, and the road haulage has largely taken over so much of rail freight, and with the decline of coal-fired power stations, that's taken away one of the major markets for the rail freight operators. So it's a very complex system. By the end of the 1990s, usage of the passenger railways had increased considerably, although there were different views as to whether this increase had been down to the efficiency and the improvements introduced by the private sector operators, or whether in fact it was simply a reflection of growth in the economy which was leading to a greater economic activity and therefore greater use of the railways. Certainly many of the companies were making good profits, and passengers, as always, complained about ticket prices. In 2001, Railtrack, the operator and owner of the infrastructure, was struggling to finance a several £billion major upgrade on part of the railway. It was seeing a considerable increase in the cost forecasts for carrying out this work. At the same time, punctuality across the network had collapsed following a major accident, an accident caused by gauge corner cracking on the railway, on the rail lines, and therefore Railtrack had imposed speed restrictions across the whole network, whilst it understood the phenomenon of gauge corner cracking and to what extent that was evident across the whole railway. The result was that Railtrack was in very considerable difficulty as far as the government was concerned, and the government took the opportunity to, in fact, take over the company, put it into administration. It was at that time that I joined the railway. I'd previously been responsible for the development and the building of the new high-speed line from the Channel Tunnel into London, but my background was fundamentally infrastructure construction. And however, I was approached to become the chief executive of Railtrack in administration, and subsequently we became a new business which was called Network Rail, It was a company which didn't really have any clear ownership other than there was one created by the government. There were no shareholders, so there was no dividend to be paid. And the government effectively guaranteed any money that we borrowed, which enabled us to raise money to invest. Our functions, as I say, were exactly the same as Railtrack, but we had this letter of comfort from the government to protect us financially. Now, of course, strictly speaking, this allowed the debt to be kept off the government's balance sheet, which was attractive to the government. And whilst we were overseen by the government, we were free to make our own decisions. After a couple of years, we decided that we were uncomfortable with contractors essentially having all the data on the condition of the railway and determining the maintenance programme against a performance specification set by ourselves. Any accidents due to poor workmanship on the maintenance also came back to us ultimately as the client. So we decided to take all the maintenance activity back in-house. We ended the contracts by agreement with the contractors, and we transferred over 20,000 people from those contractors on our own payroll and under our control. That process for renewal work, which enhanced the performance of the railway, we continued to place renewal contracts with the contractors, and we were allowed, if that was enhancing and improving the railway, we were allowed a rate of return on those investments, which could be included in the track access charges, which we made to the train operators, but it also at the same time increased the asset base of the company. Moving the franchising system had become more complex. On routes where there was good passenger growth and returns, the companies were required to bid on the basis of how much they would return to the government. If it was one which required subsidy, then clearly they were bidding on the least subsidy that they required. But the franchise winner was the one who generally offered the biggest return to government. But that, of course, requires the company to take a risk on the forecast of the growth of future revenues. The same time, the government set limits on the increase in fares which it would allow, and those were often set at being limited to 1% lower than inflation, so trying to create a downward pressure on prices. On the other hand, the train operators would also be restricted on what they could do during peak hours about fares, but were allowed far more freedom on fares in the off-peak hours in order to try and attract passengers, but at the same time generate revenue. So a very complex process, and each franchise often would finish up with a different set of criteria as the government sought to find the best and optimum way in which to reach contractual relationships with the private train operators. Train operators would very often win a contract by saying to the government, well, we're willing to take on extra rental costs for trains. We're going to order new trains. It's going to be attractive to passengers, provide them with more comfort and better trains. Those trains, of course, would come from the rolling stock leasing companies. And those leasing companies were quite relaxed about taking on board the investment for the new trains because they knew that as one franchise ended, another one started. As long as the trains were up to date and in good condition, that those trains could be taken on and they would continue to recover lease funds for those trains. In fact, probably the rolling stock owners have been the most stable and consistently profitable parts of the new railway system. The company which I today chair, National Express, in 2008 had the franchise for a major intercity route on the east coast of the country between London and Scotland. At the same time, in 2008, we had the financial crisis. And a combination of a very optimistic view of the revenue that it was going to achieve by National Express in winning the franchise, together with then a decline in revenues due to the financial crisis of 2008, meant that National Express was facing losses over the subsequent years of tens of millions of pounds. it turned to the government and said, we can't carry on like this, we're not prepared to take this level of loss, and basically said to the government, you take back the keys for this franchise, we don't want the franchise any longer, and we're willing to pay to you the performance bond which they'd entered into as a guarantee of good performance. So on the one hand, in the short term, it cost a lot of money to National Express. On the other hand, they could see at least they weren't going to have this risk recurring over the next several years, which would cost them even more than the cost of having their bond called by the government. But by that time, at the same time, overall usage had returned to post-war levels. And today, the railway is at 1.8 billion passengers a year, or it was until COVID came along. So railways have, in fact, seen a considerable growth in usage, but it's becoming more and more difficult for train operators to forecast what's going to happen over the coming years. And not only National Express, but other companies have got into similar problems, resulting in government gradually taking over operation, or the contracts being renegotiated on new terms which seek to share the risk more equitably between government and the operators. But at the same time, it's meant that the whole franchising system has tended to fall into disrepute. The operator is faced with fixed access charges, fixed rolling stock lease charges, certain labour costs for drivers and guards, and so the only way to try and reduce its cost is to be optimistic about future revenues, whilst at the same time minimising marginal staff levels and costs, for example in booking offices or attending stations, which simply irritates passengers who feel that there's not sufficiently good service being offered to them, and when it comes to buying their tickets or indeed coming back to stations, particularly at night when there is no presence by the train operators on the stations. For the operators, the cost of bidding for these franchises was running into tens of millions of pounds, and the gain was not very attractive. And each tender was being adjudged on a very complex set of circumstances, and sometimes not based on previous performance. The government would ignore previous performance, resulting in what was an unpopular franchise operator simply winning again the new franchise, much to the disgruntlement of the passengers. Each time a franchise changed, all the staff would be transferred from the previous company to the new company. So from the passenger perspective, little seemed to have changed. The same people were running the railway. It was under different ownership. The livery would be changed, the trains would be repainted, the stations would be repainted, but it was rather a superficial change. Ticketing is complex and very often not interchangeable between different operators. High demand has meant overcrowding, especially for commuters, whilst any delays became a contractual argument between the Network Rail, the track operator, and the train operators as to who was responsible, and money would exchange backwards and forwards according to who was responsible for particular delays, resulting in yet more cost in these systems which simply were there to attribute delay. And these arguments would sometimes go on for months at end. All of this in public minds has led to increasing calls for the good old days, fondly remembered by anyone over 60, and not known at all by anyone under 40, for renationalisation of the railway. These debates fall into party political lines, with the left calling for nationalisation and the right wing for maintaining the status quo. In the last couple of years, this resulted in an independent review, which the government has not yet published, but gradually some of its recommendations are being introduced. That overall situation has been further exacerbated by COVID-19, the collapse of passenger numbers down to some literally 10 to 20% of previous numbers. That has resulted in the companies saying, well, we can't continue on this basis, and the government having to step in, provide financial support, but it's doing that in return for more control. Margins are being reduced, but at least the train operators are getting some financial help in what is a very difficult situation. It's likely that future franchises are going to be based on the government taking the revenue risk. deciding on the timetables, deciding on the routes, and the private sector operator being paid a fixed fee, but with penalties and bonuses for under or over performance. In the meantime, the technical argument that Network Rail's debt should not be on the government balance sheet has been reversed, and as a result, the government has taken more and more control of the management of Network Rail and the infrastructure. One of the consequences of that is likely to be that the government will want to impose public sector salaries on the future staff employed by Network Rail, considerably less than those enjoyed in the private sector, so further complicating the willingness of people to work for Network Rail if they're going to earn less money as a government employee than they would have done as a private sector employee of Network Rail. So what do we conclude from this history? Well, frankly, the public ultimately will always hold the government to account for the performance of the railway. The public naturally wants an optimum service for the lowest possible ticket price. In theory, at least, what a private sector competitive approach should offer. High performance, low cost. That's what the private sector is supposedly very often in other sectors about. Public opinion, on the other hand, shows consistently that what the public want is a reliable, frequent service, comfortable service, and all of that is more important to them actually than speed. Punctuality is more important on short journeys than it is on long journeys as far as the public is concerned. There's also a dislike amongst the public of what they see as potentially large profits by the private sector for providing what they regard as an essential service, no different to the provision of water or electricity. It's very difficult, therefore, to recover high levels of investment in infrastructure and rolling stock purely through the fare box. And has been seen time and time again around the world, quite difficult to recover the capital cost of the railway through the fare box. Open competition on the railway with its fixed access controls and train paths is also very difficult. Trains cannot overtake other trains. You can compete for the space, but even that requires significant control. And the government inevitably finishes up setting more and more the outputs that it expects. If you look around the world, there is no perfect system. Swiss and Japanese railways are famed for their reliability and punctuality. In Japan, the history of the railway is similar to the UK, with post-war nationalisation and privatisation of the railway in the late 80s. In Japan, the private companies are very large corporations, but they're vertically integrated. Not only do they run the trains, they control the infrastructure, and they also own property and land around the railway and have indeed been able to influence the development of communities and housing such that in a sense they create their own market by ensuring that new settlements are built alongside the railway, creating demand for the railway. Profitability largely, however, once again comes from intercity and urban lines, and in recent years some of these private companies in Japan have started closing down some of their unprofitable rural operations. In Japan, as we know, there is a strong culture of attention to detail. Heavy redundancy is built into the systems to make them more reliable, and a very strong focus on punctuality. So strong, in fact, that at times people have argued that this has created risk and has caused accidents where the desire to keep the trains moving exactly on time has led to trains being released into the network or past signals when they should not have been. Rails in Japan also still carry a very significant proportion of all journeys, despite the growth in car usage. So Japan, a relatively successful example of privatization. The other railway, which of course is seen as being very successful, is the Swiss railway, but it's only 3,000 kilometers long. It's relatively small compared with other, particularly European systems, but it's owned and controlled by the federal government or by the cantons of Switzerland. It's 100% electrified, and it's again renowned for its punctuality. So Japan, privately operated and seen as being very successful. Switzerland, equally successful, but state-owned. So the challenges of the railways are not really dissimilar to other essential utilities. The government at the end of the day is always going to be held responsible by voters. Users don't really want to have to pay the costs of future investment to ensure future resilience or enhancements for increased demand. They don't want to pay for the future through today's ticket price. Yes, as many of us would argue, the private sector can be more effective and more efficient at controlling costs than governments are. But railways, it's been proven, I think, in many cases and pretty consistently around the world, will always need some form of public subsidy, and so become inseparable from politics, with the risk of short-term decisions that are inherent in democracies, which are likely to come about from political interference. Changing from one system to another is like turning a supertanker, and we cannot be certain of the results. Finding the right balance between public and private remains a major challenge. I've worked for both, and I would argue to a large extent the most important issues around railways are good management, same as any other business. What makes for a good business? Cooperation. The more commercial, the more contractual you become, the more you try and impose conditions on your suppliers and wrap them up in red tape, then the more confrontational the relationship becomes. The railway, as I said earlier on, is about connection between wheel and rail. Separate the wheel and rail, put between those into that interface complex contractual arrangements, and you'll create problems, as we've seen. And in consequence, we've seen a movement back in the UK to bringing those two together. It's not straightforward. Perhaps it's a reflection of human relationships generally. Good management, we all understand what good management means. Clear objectives, a clear vision, the ability to cooperate with other people, the ability to work with other people, to understand other people's perspective, to put yourself in the customer's shoes. The public don't really mind who runs the railways. They want a reliable railway, a punctual railway, a comfortable railway. Whether it's owned by the private sector, whether it's owned by the public sector, is frankly, I think, at the end of the day, immaterial to the consumer. And as we've learnt to say in so many industries, the consumer has to be the ultimate decider, and the consumer then is the voter, and so the government becomes inevitably heavily involved. The future, I think, frankly, we'll probably see a move away from privatisation to more government control in order to provide what the customer ultimately wants and accept that there is going to be a degree of subsidy. The challenge is how do you introduce the private sector to make that an efficient process. So I think it's very much watch this space in the UK, and I know that many other countries are facing similar challenges, similar debates. If there is a move that I would opine, and others may have a different view, that actually it is a move back towards more state control and away from privatisation. But that perhaps is something that can be debated as we go forward. So that's all from me. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions in the remaining 10 minutes or so, then I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir John, for sharing your knowledge and vast experience with the railways. If you would allow me, I would like to pose some questions regarding the future and after COVID times. So we are now going through extraordinary times. I mean, no one was expecting this COVID, and so I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I'm sorry, I'm unable to hear anything at the moment.
Okay, just a second. Can you hear me now?
Hello. Hello. Sorry. Yes, the page should be on. Yeah, I can see myself on the screen. Okay. Hello.
Hello, can you hear me now? Hi,
Yes.
welcome back.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem. So let me take it from the beginning. So I was thanking you for sharing your vast experience with the railways and also shedding light onto the history of the railways. So if you would allow me, I would like to pose some questions regarding what's going to happen in the future. And like we are now going through extraordinary times. So no one was expecting this COVID to happen. This was like unexpected for both public, the customers, the private sector. So what are your expectations about like the after COVID time? I mean, are there any legislations, any special policies that need to be undertaken in the future after the COVID is gone?
Well, clearly, the real challenge of COVID is going to be the extent and the pace at which people come back to using the railways. The pace at which they come back to using the railway is fundamentally going to be dictated, I think, by government policies. I mean, across the world at the moment, particularly here in the UK, we have government telling people to stay at home, not to go to work from home. And we've
Right.
all, normally speaking, I would be in Istanbul today, and here we are carrying it out by Zoom. And I spend half my life these days on Zoom. And the offices that I attend, none of those offices have yet reopened. So we're all operating from home. The result, nobody traveling by train. The real challenge is to make any sort of judgment as to where we are going to be in 2 or 3 years' time, whether we will see a return to largely normal and perhaps an increase in home working by people, maybe 10, 20%. Surveys of staff in companies that I'm involved in at the moment, people are saying, well, yes, in future, I'd like to have the freedom to work from home for at least 1 day a week. Some people say, I'd like to work from home 2 days a week. Most of us say we miss the human contact, the interconnection with people across a table. A meeting on Zoom is never quite the same as being in the same room. You don't pick up the body language in quite the same way. In the meantime, I think governments are going to be left with very little choice, as they are with so many things, in supporting the operation of these networks. The government will have to say to itself in many countries, well, we can see the revenues are not going to be there. That is going to diminish either the public sector or the private sector, according to who's running the trains. So we're going to have to subsidize it even more. And everybody is going to be, in a sense, keeping their fingers crossed that the COVID will pass, we'll find a vaccine, and in a year or two's time, things will have returned largely to normal. A lot depends on your belief in cities. If you believe that this is going to change people's attitude to living in cities, that will change the number of people traveling. I think that personally, I would say, as we say in England, the jury is out. The jury is yet undecided as to what the future really holds, but it means a period of uncertainty. And as we're seeing, that uncertainty is increasing government's debt. And the only different thing about government debt is that we've seen a complete reversal in the last couple of weeks by the IMF, who've now decided that it's not such a bad thing for governments to carry large amounts of debt because interest rates are low, and therefore it's not the disaster that they thought it was in 2008. I would say it's just politics, 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 and you can never take the politics out of infrastructure.
Yeah, this is influenced by politics and it's part of politics. I mean, it has to be. And yes, you're right. I mean, there's so many uncertainties about like how the work is going to be, how the cities are going to be. I mean, now we are seeing people moving out of the cities, the big cities, because of the cost of living and everything. So when we think about like a farther time, like let me say in like 10 years, in 2030, how do you see that like that's been evolving? Like what percentage of railways would be in the total transportation? Like what are your expectations apart from COVID? I mean, if we are not going to
Well,
going through another unexpected period.
I think we're coming in for an absolutely fascinating period of transport challenges. The bigger issue around the world is climate change. Climate change, the decarbonisation of our transport systems. Therefore, trains are either going to be further electrified, or perhaps alternatively, in the case of freight trains, a move towards, in some cases, hydrogen as the base fuel for a hydrogen fuel cell driven train. There is a sort of dystopian view of the world which says that autonomous cars will become the future. We'll call these cars up on our mobile phones, but you can see that that potentially could lead to massive congestion. So to what extent is public transport going to continue to have a major part to play? I would argue personally that public transport will have to actually become more and more efficient, more and more effective. Otherwise, we'll finish up with a world in which everybody wants his own private little bubble that he can call up on his mobile phone, jump into, it'll be autonomous, and it'll take him off to wherever he wants to go. And he'll be paying remotely, using his phone again to pay. I think that is probably too extreme, too ambitious. An expectation, and that the need and the efficiency which comes from large-scale public transport will remain, and therefore in cities, tram systems and light rail systems will continue to prevail, and between cities, more and more efficient, more and more comfortable public transport systems and the railways will continue to exist. The challenge, as always, will be the one of, well, what is the charge to the passenger? Does the passenger feel that it's good value for money to make the journey? And that becomes a taxation problem fundamentally for governments, as to what extent the passenger has to pay for his exclusive use, or to what extent we all pay through general taxation to keep the level of those ticket prices down.
True. So, I mean, you've been talking about the public sector and the operators working together and some challenges that they go through. I mean, this was like since even before the First World War that they had these challenges and the pain points. So, if you just like look at the current times, what do you think are the main pain points of this relationship? Like the public sector working with the private operators, and how would you suggest to overcome these challenges?
Well, I think the main pain point, let me put it the other way, the challenge for the operator at the end of the day is satisfying the customer. It's no different to any other business. Is the passenger satisfied with the service? Now, they'll judge when you question the public, when you say to them, what do you want? I've been involved in doing this quite recently in the UK. What do you expect from a rail service? They'll say, we want reliability. Well, they want safety. They take safety for granted. They want a frequency of service, because if there isn't a frequent service, then they won't use it, because it just doesn't suit them. They want a service which is relatively frequent. They don't want to stand. They want to have a seat. They want to be comfortable. The journey time itself, they argue, is less important to them than those other factors. So contrary to all of us who believe in high speed as being the most important thing, if you ask the public what they want, speed is less important than reliability and frequency. Now then it becomes, well, how do you structure and pay for that? And the public, again, see the government largely as the person who controls and is responsible at the end of the day for ensuring satisfactory transport systems. So the government has to decide how it's going to deliver that. Is it going to take control and do it itself, or is it going to seek to cooperate with private companies? As soon as you cooperate with a private company, then there has to be a contractual basis. And the risk is so often that that contractual basis becomes more and more complex because the public sector is wanting to hold the private sector operator accountable to a whole series of different targets, standards, quality of service, all of which have a financial implication. And so you finish up almost with a collision of interest between the private sector who's wanting to make his profit, is being held to account by all these what he sees at times as being rather draconian demands from his clients, the government. And as somebody who spent a lot of his life as a contractor, it's really no different to the relationship that many people would see with a builder, which has often been a very a relationship of conflict between clients and builders. And somehow you have to get to a point where there is trust, and trust is so important in all of this, trust and cooperation with shared objectives in which each party feels that it's getting fairly treated by the other. The private sector is being allowed to make a reasonable return on the risk that it's taking. And equally, the public sector feels it's getting a good performance from the private sector and isn't having to pay too much for that good performance. So there has to be a sensible sharing of risk and opportunity between the two. The difficulty, of course, is that to a certain extent, this all comes down to trust and human relationships. And I mean, I saw myself when I was in charge of Network Rail that my relationship with individual train operators would change according to who was running it from my side. And when I put one man in charge of running a part of the railway, and he would fall out with the train operator and they'd be coming to blows and there'd be major arguments and disputes between us. And then you change, and either the train operator would change his top manager or I'd change my top manager, and all of a sudden they'd be getting on famously well and the performance would be improving simply because those human relationships were working more effectively. So it's like so many things in life, human relationships tend to drive so much of this.
Yeah. I mean, regardless of what business area you're working in, it all comes to the human relations. So that's so true. So to sum up our discussion, there is one last question that I would like to ask you. How do you see the current state of Turkish railway? I mean, is there any suggestion that we could use to even improve our services, or like the current state of our railways?
I must confess I'm not an expert on the current state of Turkish railways. I was asked to do this a few days ago, and I must confess I've not researched the current state of Turkish railways. I have in the past worked in Turkey as a contractor, building hotels and grain silos in ports. So my experience of Turkey was more in infrastructure building than it was in operating infrastructure. So I don't think it would be fair of me to make any comment. All I would say is that I think when you look at whether you look at France, Germany, Britain, wherever you look, the challenges, America, the challenges are not dissimilar. And essentially, at the end of the day, this comes down to the government deciding, does it want to run the railways, or does it want to run the railways in partnership with private companies? And if it wants to run it in partnership, then what's going to be the commercial basis of that partnership? And if that isn't based on a belief of trust between them, sensible commercial relationships, a proper sharing of risks, then probably there'll be problems. If you can have that trust, if you can have a sensible commercial relationship, then you have the ingredients, at least, of a potentially successful operation.
Yeah, so I mean, as I was like listening to you talking about the Swiss and Japanese railways and how they are like outperforming when you compare to the other countries.
Yep.
Like, I have just like derived from what you've been talking is the customer service, really making the customer happy, I think, is the essence of success. So like being punctual, just like, you know, providing that good service, because at the end it's the making this more successful or less successful. Because if you make the customer happy, then you're better than any other.
And of course, the challenge for the railways so often is that they're run by engineers. I'm an engineer. Engineers, we tend to be very rational, and we see things through, well, why on earth can't the customer understand my problems? Because, there's a good technical reason for why I've got this problem. The customer isn't interested in your technical problem. He just wants a train on time. He wants it to be reliable. Don't tell me all your problems, Mr. Engineer. Just give me the answer. And sometimes for engineers, that's quite difficult to recognise. Which is why you need people who are really within the organisation, not only your engineers but others who are doing the customer facing. And I think a big challenge for us as engineers across all infrastructure actually is to recognise that engineering is not an end in itself. Engineering is the process of delivering a function which works for the public. All engineering leads to a service for the public or a provision of a piece of equipment for the public. The public aren't interested in what's under the bonnet. They want something that works and is reliable. And that's what we have to recognize as engineers.
Yeah, so one suggestion would be involve your marketing teams, your customer success teams, so that you are more customer facing and customer focused and trying to understand what their needs are.
Exactly.
Okay, so thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your knowledge with us. I'm wishing you a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Düşlediğin geleceğe giden bir yol var. Gelişimin adı demir harflerle yazılacak o yola. Yenilik sesleri yükselecek Türkiye'den dünyaya. Gelecek güzel günler raylardan ulaşacak bizlere. Şimdi başlayan bu dönüşüm yarınların öncüsü, gelecek günlerin öncesi olacak. Demir yolu atılımı demir ağlarla örülmüş Türkiye'ye çok yakışacak. Türk Demiryolu Zirvesi